So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this pre-meeting before the official start of our workshop today. We are very delighted that Professor Stevens, in spite of several pressing appointments and challenges at this moment, he has made himself physically available to engage us or engage with us. So on behalf of the Engaging African Realities Project, please accept our profound gratitude for your flexibility, your selflessness, and your interest in our project. We really appreciate this. So to the rest of you, welcome, and we hope that this very brief session would be motivating and would perhaps attempt to answer some lingering questions and issues that you have, not simply about Professor Stevens' earlier presentations, but also in terms of applicability, of this to your own projects and work. So I want to encourage you, when you have a chance to speak or make a comment, do make it as brief as possible, so that we can engage many of you at the same time. So again, it's going to be a fairly informal session. Let's use the same procedure of indicating interest in raising a question or comment by either raising your hand virtually or physically, or posting your question or comment in the chat. And then we'll take it one after the other. So welcome, and let's get it on. So you can just start if the Spirit leads you. Who would like to start? All right, maybe it's so early in the time. Professor Stevens, maybe I can ask, you have, quite well brought up the whole dynamics of grounded theology. And I know one question is how people deal with this, taking it from theory into practice. Is there any advice you can give in terms of translation of these theoretical ideas into practice, experience? And I know, because I raised that, JC is now ready with the hand up. So can I take Jesse's question and you can tackle both if you will? Look,
let me take one at a time.
Okay.
Because, at my time of night, it's easier for me to keep one thing in my head at a time.
Okay.
Look, first of all, I think that the way to do grounded theology is to become totally familiar with grounded theory and exactly what it's trying to do, but to realize that you're translating where theory is, you're looking at theology. So that's simply the insight. So you immerse yourself in your data. One of my students did a qualitative study and put all the interviews around her house on the wall. So everywhere she went, from the bathroom, she was immersed, almost literally immersed in her data, and then understanding that it's from the data that that your actual theology comes, it emerges. Now, one topic that I had never thought of, but I think could be an interesting grounded theology topic is, do traditional African culture around dreams, is it different? Do dreams play a different part in African culture? I honestly don't know. I haven't got a clue. But it seems to me that that's actually possible. And that could be a matter, not a means of actually doing theology. I mean, there's in one of the great theories is psychoanalysis. And I spent 20 years in the area of psychoanalysis. One of the great practitioner theoreticians was Thomas Ogden. And he talked about the analyst having reverie and being able to just play with thoughts that come to him or her when they're doing psychoanalysis. I wonder if that's like a half dreaming state. And can something like reverie be generative of theology? In other words, I'm looking at it, I mean, just it actually asks for a different methodology. I mean, can we do theology asleep? Can we do theology in a half state of half sleep? I honestly don't know. But that's the sort of questions that lead to highly original contributions in the area of theology, and I would hope from an African perspective.
Thank you, Bruce. Jesse, and then there's a question from Paul. Jesse, can you unmute? And
okay. Hi, good morning. Thank you for coming on, Professor Bruce. I think it's just a continuation of the discussion that I didn't think we landed properly the last time about grounded theology and the place of literature review. And I had mentioned that my supervisor had said, you know, if your research is being informed by the field, then hear from the field first, then you engage with detailed literature review, so you have the boldness to come to literature. And I just thought what your thoughts are about that.
Look, the field is, there is a discussion from both sides on that, and there's probably strengths and weaknesses of each side. So I tended to probably do a literature review at some point, maybe not at the earliest stages when I'm trying to look for my ideas, because part of what you're looking for is what surprises you. I mean, I was surprised about the idea of the two people reported, I think it was two people reported their significant religious experience in dreams. Now, I'm not sure that would happen in a Western country. I just don't know. But you know, that surprised me and interested me. So therefore, it asks me, how do we develop this idea? Now, there's a huge amount of literature on dreams. I don't know how much there is on the theology of dreams, but because I've published on dreams, I analyzed 20 of my own dreams for one study, for example, and I found it very interesting to do that. But it wasn't a theology project. That was a more clinical psychology project. But so I think the other thing is, there's no right or wrong way in some of this ideas of research. To me, try it and see what works for you. I mean, try and get out of a mindset of there is a right way to do research. I mean, you hear a lot of oughts and musts and shoulds, and I think it's actually unhelpful. I think we should be playing, you know, with our ideas, loosen ourselves up and just allow ourselves to be almost play or toss ideas around. I think that a good theologian is like a juggler, tossing ideas around. So, and I think that there's so little generative theology and so much sort of churned out theology from a sort of research formula or something, you know, and it's obvious what I prefer. But I think that idea of playfulness, of allowing yourself to play with ideas, see where it goes, be curious, gentle and curious. I mean, that's what I think is so exciting about the potential of something like grounded theology.
No, thank you, Bruce, for that response. Just to add a footnote, I think we have to be very careful to go to the field, you know, with a brain that is tabula rasa.
Yes.
You know, how do you, in the first place, establish your research question? You know, because if you go to the field and you think that your mother's soup is the sweetest, is the best. Without
Sorry, what was that last
checking.
phrase? If I go to the field thinking, what was that again?
Yeah, that your mother's soup, the soup
yeah.
prepared by your mother is the sweetest in the world. You might well find that there are other soups out there. So I think sometimes it's important to see what has been done in that particular, because in that particular topic or field, so that you are not reinventing the wheel, and setting your research question and objectives by looking at what exists out there actually enables you to find the loopholes, the missing gaps. Otherwise, you may be asking the same question that 50 people have asked 50 years ago. So,
yes,
of course, you shouldn't take theories and then be looking for the data. I think this has been emphasized. But your acquaintance, doing your literature review enables you actually to identify where you are and where you are going. So, Jesse, I think this point needs to be carefully noted. It's like saying that I'm doing a PhD, I want to do a PhD project. I don't write my PhD proposal and literature review. I go to the field first before coming back to write my research proposal. I think that can be
that would be disastrous. I agree.
Yes.
Look, I fully agree. I tend myself to want to do literature review and look at the gaps, and I think you're right, it's safe. But I'm just saying that in the field of grounded theory, there is a debate about whether you do the literature review first and whether it stifles your creativity. Yeah. And you need to be aware of that debate. I'm probably coming, if I do any further studies, I mean, for example, believing in luck, and problem gamblers believe in luck. They believe it's magical.
Yeah.
So that's part of the literature. People have done studies on problem gamblers and how they actually approach the idea of luck. So they're probably the only people that actually believe in the magic of luck. Yeah. Maybe some cultures, I think Chinese culture has a strong emphasis on luck. So yes, you would have to be aware or you're not contextual. And I agree with you. The safest way, certainly as a researcher, is that combining that rigor of looking at your field, doing the literature review, examining where the gaps are. But one thing about grounded theology is you can actually, there's so little of it that you can, it's an open field. It's like being an explorer or something, you know. It's not hard to find gaps when you're the first person doing a certain kind of methodology.
No, thank you. Yeah, Jesse, you still have your hand. I'll give you a chance. But I think I just want to cycle back to research proposals or PhD research proposals. How do you establish the rationale for your work? You know, I think that is very important. And one thing I found out when I read PhD proposals or other research proposals, some people saying carelessly, there's no one who has done something on this topic. I'm the first person. You are kidding, because how do you establish that? First of all, you need rigorous library research to be able to establish, because I have just written a book about my local community. And if I pretend and say I'm the first person, I'm kidding. I have found literature in 1910, in 1930 that I'm using now. So digging deep enables you to actually start on a good footing. Jesse, are you disagreeing with that, or otherwise we turn to Paul?
No, I'm not disagreeing with that. I just thought maybe I was being misunderstood when I made my comment. What I meant, of course, you have to do. I mean, I'm still like really early, but of course, I had to do the literature review for the PhD proposal. And what I was talking about was the in-depth writing up of those analyses of the literature review before going into the field. Because I mean, I needed to do literature review to get my research questions and identify the originality of my own research. But it was about the writing of the process of the detailed writing of the chapters. Do you do that? after the field. And I said that writing up after my analyzing my fieldwork gave me the boldness. Now, I may be wrong, I may be right, but it gave me the boldness to now engage with in-depth literature review of the select literature that I had identified before going into the field. And I just wanted to put that, Professor Bruce talking about the playfulness of it, where you have identified.
Jesse, I get you. Let me just respond to that. Yeah, when you write your literature review chapter in your work, and then you do your data collection and analysis and you write up, the process of analysis and write up enables you to revisit your literature review. It's not detached. If you write your thesis and all the big names you mentioned and all the theories and arguments you mentioned in your literature review, you never refer back to them in your discussion, in your presentation and analysis, that's a detached work. If I'm examining that, you won't pass, because you must constantly go back to how does your data and analysis, respond, either corroborate or critique the existing literature that is out there. If you don't demonstrate that ability to engage what is out there, then you don't have a thesis. So I think the point you made is spot on. So you must, whether you are writing, you're doing a project now, the project you are doing, you wrote a bit of literature review and all that, you won the grant. By the time you are writing up your report, if you don't refer, go back and see where that literature makes sense and nonsense, then your work is half-baked. So I think everyone needs to take this on board. I'm looking at the time. Paul, your question is, where does description end and creativity starts in grounded theology? Bruce.
Paul, great question. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. Where does description start? And look, I think creativity is in the theory or the theology. It's what emerges from your data. So be alert. It's what we notice. I mean, if we got, like I said, if you immerse yourself in your data, you're going to start noticing ideas that just ask to be explored and dealt with further. I happen to believe that you can't squeeze it out of your data. It's more appropriate is to be playful. And I know that doesn't fit in with a lot of scholarly approaches, but I think that the generating of theory, and in our case theology, is in fact comes from a playful engagement and noticing what's interesting, what stands out. I mean, like I had that first session, what stood out for me and begged me to think more about it is African experience of dreams and how we might do theology differently with that perspective. Now, that was what stood out to me. I mean, and that could be a research project that could last 10 years. I honestly don't know how much, I don't know what the literature is in dreaming in Africa. I don't know the literature for dreams and doing theology and methodology around it. But it just seems to me, here's an area that was taken seriously in the Bible. There's no question about that. People changed the course of their ministry through dreams. Kings responded to dreams on behalf of the people. So, I mean, here's an area that's interesting in the Bible. And, it could be, that's how I do it. I mean, that's how I would do it. I'd follow up an area like that. It seemed like a completely open area, and who knows where it would lead. And it might be useless. I mean, it might spend 6 months doing it and find that you've got so many methodological problems that it doesn't work. But that's the risk of research. We often chase the wrong rabbit down the wrong hole. But a good idea is what's important. If that makes sense. That's how I see it. So I see it emerging from your data. So it's grounded and it becomes theory/theology.
Thank you, Bruce, for that response. And if I cycle back to Jesse again, the idea of dreams, Bruce, that you think is very striking. Yeah, it's something that is pervasive within indigenous cosmologies. So it would really be interesting how, some of the grantees could, pay attention to this. But it's not just dreams. There's also prophecy. There are also other themes that might jump out. And I remember, for instance, Rudolph, can you unmute? Rudolph is dealing with something around prophecy. And if Rudolph was not careful to dig into literature, you can just assume that, oh, no one has done anything about prophecy in Africa. But it was quite instructive going back into literature to find that there were projects, sponsored projects, large projects on prophecy that has generated a lot of literature already. So the question would be, how do you dig into that literature and see what approaches, what methodologies, what ideas came out of those projects? And that enables you to situate the kind of questions we'll now be asking. If those research projects were done from a theological perspective or from a sociological perspective, then you might be asking questions that are perhaps different, maybe anthropological question or political question, those kind of things. So again, just to reinforce the point you are making, I'm using the question of dreams very importantly now that has come up. Don't think that, well, maybe this idea of dreams that have come up here is entirely new. You will discover that perhaps 60 years ago, there were already articles or books on dreams in Africa. So it's imperative that you go back, dig back in order to move forward. Don't say you are clearing a virgin forest, because that is not.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Rudolph, do you want to say something about that, just to make it concrete, and then we go to Reko's questions? Rudolph, he's still meditating. Okay, let's go to Reko.
No, sorry, I'm just a bit under the weather, but been listening in.
Yes.
And I think I take away the caution and encouragement, the balance between the literature review and then what you find on the field.
Okay, I wanted you to share experience with your idea around prophecy you are working on.
No, I'm working on Proverbs.
Oh, Proverbs. Sorry, not prophecy. Proverbs. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
So, what was your experience in terms of navigating what is there, and how you came about your questions?
Yeah. So, one key book by the name doesn't come readily, but he was in Ghana and did a work on Proverbs among the Kasem Christians and their use of Proverbs in their church activities. So coupled with what, again, you were helpful indicating my attention to what MBT and Co did some time back. That also gave me some ideas on what to do. Because of my interest in how that can play out within the church, the local churches that I'm interested in, I think that helped me to some extent. But again, listening to all that have been said so far, definitely I'm having to go to look at it again to see how I'm flexible enough, make it open. So what I find on the field eventually can also help me with proper interpretation and what's it. I think that's what I can say for now.
Okay, thank you, Rudolph. Let's go to Reko. Reko first responded to Paul's question. Grounded theology ends with theory, but in social sciences, theory and methodology are linked. Where do you begin? So that's the first part. The second, what of the risk of conversion? One anthropologist said to study religion, learn how to listen and to see, to hear, see, and know when the spirits are approaching. If you learn to see, hear, know, is this not a slippery slope into conversion? a very risky situation where the researcher is Christian researching African traditional religion. Bruce?
I don't understand the issue of conversion. Can you explain that to me, Afi?
Okay, Reko, can you unmute if the God of the internet is with you today? And
okay. Conversion, I mean, you know, yesterday, for example, Professor Tayo showed us the case of a masquerade being allowed into mass and how it caused a lot of controversy. Obviously, the controversy is about, you know, keeping clear lines between, you know, Christianity and traditional religion. So, for example, if you are a Christian, there's a lot of emphasis for you to sort of to stay a Christian. You can't have a lot of knowledge about traditional, especially African traditional religions. You know how they work, and you even know when the spirits are coming, or you know, that sort of thing. You are attending ceremonies and things like that. You are there doing research. If you are so knowledgeable, isn't there a risk? That's all I'm asking, that you become converted, you become so knowledgeable in the religion that perhaps you are no longer a Christian, so to speak. You are contaminated. I don't know.
Well, is it, I mean, that's the old anthropologist question of whether you're observing the tribe or joining the tribe, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
Surely there's an argument for both sides. I mean, you have a different kind of knowledge by joining. I mean, I realize it's risky, but if you join the tribe and actually look at the world through their eyes, then you actually have access to a different kind of knowledge, I would have thought.
Okay, maybe let me, if I were to talk about something controversial, there's a bit of witchcraft. There's a bit of witchcraft involved. What do you do?
Well, different people would have different theologies around that. Some would see it as simply local creativity or something, and others would see it's a dangerous syncretism with where Christ is not honoured. But I would suggest that there is a pluralism of perspective on that, from more the liberal Protestant or Christian through to say fundamentalist perspectives, and who's to know? I mean, it becomes a question of epistemology. You know, what's right and what's wrong on those questions. I mean, look, I grant there's a risk, but even if you lose some researchers to conversion, I'm not sure, you know, is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm not sure. You know, I'm a traditional Christian. I believe the creeds, but you know, I'm not. My perspective is not the only perspective. There are different perspectives, and you can be a scholar of, say, traditional religion, surely, and a believer at the same time in traditional religion. So, some people would say that's the only way to do participant knowledge or something. You know, I'm just. To me, it's a pluralism. There's different perspectives, and they're arguably each have a weakness or a strength, and some are valid or invalid. So I suppose I'm being a little bit relativist on perspective.
Thank you, Bruce. If I can add a footnote, Reko, I think we must admit the limitations of research. Researchers cannot know everything. It's just impossible. Two, researchers actually, we don't know what is true or false in most cases when we talk to our respondents, interlocutors. You know, we take what they tell us, but we cannot sometimes verify. If somebody says, well, I'm just having a dream that God is speaking to me now, how do we dissect, you know, the brain and stomach to know whether it was actually God or whether actually there was a speaking? So I think we must recognize the limitations, but methodologically, we think about insertion. To what extent, how far can we go? But also we think about detachment. methodological detachment. We think about methodological conversion. So I think there are definitely limitations, and you cannot answer all the questions. If somebody told me, well, I had a dream last night, is that empirically verifiable? But how do I represent that? Of course, I'm not going to say you are lying, or it's not, you had too much beer last night, so you're just hallucinating, you know. But how to capture what our respondents tell us, how to capture what we see, how to capture what we hear. It's a delicate, and I think this is what Bruce is saying, the playfulness. How do we play around with this, you know, cognitive, you know, kind of properties at the same time, without misreading, without misinterpreting what we are seeing, hearing, and so on and so forth. So it's a continuous debate, and I think this opens up also the question of engaged studies, you know, and so on and so forth. So let's leave that for now. Reko, I'm sure that we can have this conversation continued. Alisa made a very intriguing comment, and she says, I'm intrigued about this notion of dreams as a grounded theology. Dreams as well as prophecy, although I was corrected, also Proverbs, you know, is also very common in the Caribbean. Do you want to wet us with this idea a little bit more? What was that
word with their idea? I missed.
Okay, sorry, Bruce. I was asking Alisa if she could
I just didn't hear
what
the
her
word.
Imagination.
No, I don't have much to add. Although I guess one of the things that I was wondering is, you know, in the research that would need to be done on such a subject, how are we looking at it not only in the continent of Africa, but throughout the diaspora? So not realizing, looking at it in terms of, yes, it may be different than the West, but with all the migration that we have and the diaspora throughout the world, then maybe it's not so different among certain cultures in the West. Because coming from a Caribbean background and being here in the US, and the people I'm among, the church that I'm in, which is an American church, dreams is very much you know, is very much a thing, as well as prophecy. So I think it's even broader than what we making it out to be. And I just, to me, that would mean that the research will probably be even greater on this.
Yes, no, thank you, Alisa. This is a very salient point you are raising. Let's be very careful that whatever we are seeing is not typically African, you know.
Yes, yeah.
Because these are features everywhere in the world. Dreams and prophecy and proverbs, you have it all over the world. So this also makes it imperative not simply to be looking at literature on Africa, but to be looking at, you know, literature elsewhere, because all these phenomenon are not peculiar. And I can tell you, I teach a class on indigenous religions, and when I teach about witchcraft and sorcery, my starting point, my first few lectures is to survey witchcraft in USA, witchcraft in Europe, before talking about witchcraft in Africa. And then my American students and European students are thinking, oh gosh, so this is not an African thing? So I think you need to appreciate that look, some of these things, when we say, oh, Africans do this, Africans do that, you know, I talked about generalizations again, that we have to be very careful what we say, because what we think is typically African, just like Alisa is saying, is very evident, not just in the African diaspora, but in other societies. So you must have a good grasp, not only about dreams in Africa, you must have a good grasp about dreams elsewhere, because the literature is very rife, and I think that is a very salient point. Bruce, do you want to?
I just wanted to say we had such a good lecture yesterday by Professor Adesina And, you know, he's saying there's no shortcuts, you know, you've got to do the history, you've got to do the contextual work. And Lisa, I think you're saying exactly the same thing. It's just being a good scholar. But being a good scholar doesn't mean you can't be creative. I mean, to me, the creativity part is what makes the difference between a good and a great scholar. I mean, one of my favorite theologians is Jürgen Moltmann. You know, why is he a great scholar? Because he's a great creative thinker. You know, it's not just his methodology. There's 10,000 theologians that are equal in probably methodology to Jürgen Moltmann. But he's a great scholar because he's a creative scholar. He knew where the edge was. He knew the crucified God at a certain period in time was just something that just had to be re-embraced, you know. And to me, it's that creativity that will make a difference between a forgettable piece of scholarship, which most is, and something that's memorable.
No, thank you, Bruce. I'm looking at the time. We have 5 minutes. There's a comment by Akin. I think when it comes to the religion of the Africans, positions should also respect what is said, just as one would other religions. It's not the job of a researcher to place value on what has been said. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure anyone would dispute this, but I think we need to also be reflexive when we say the religion of the Africans. Which Africans are you talking about? So again, question of generalizations that we make. And just to stamp the other point I mentioned before, I often argue that the best way to know about yourself, the best way to know about your community, the best way to know about your society is by knowing about others. And it has worked well for me. The best way to know who I am is by knowing others and what sometimes they think about me, because identity can be created in a multiplicity of ways, you know, either your self-identification, but also the public ascription. You know, the way you know who you are is also to know how people think about you, and how people think about you shapes how sometimes you think about yourself. As an immigrant here, I'm seen not as a Nigerian, and I'm African, you know, so the tendency to villagize Africa makes some people now, when you're traveling to Africa, you say, where are you going? Rather than say, I'm going to Harare, or I'm going to Accra, say I'm going to Africa. So that kind of multiple impact is important. There's a question from Setagwe, and perhaps that will be the last question on this round. Epistemologists that critique a positivist approach cast doubt on the extent to which data can inform theory or interpretation. That is why they say we can have the same pool of data and come up with different interpretations, theories. That is why some of us can see something that has not been seen by others. Foucault talks in terms of making things visible in the invisible. So creativity could take such a turn. My question, how much does grounded theology allows for such seeing?
What was that last word, Ape?
Yes?
Allow for such, I missed that last word.
Okay, allows for such seeing in quotation mark. Seeing, to see, yeah.
Okay, seeing, okay. Look, I agree with what he was saying, but I mean, even to critique positivism, which I think is a highly limited perspective, you've got to take a stance. There's no neutral observer. And it comes down to, I mean, if you did a PhD, for example, at Princeton versus, say, Harvard versus, say, Chicago versus Graduate Theological Union, you know, what would the difference of context be in terms of the research and the PhD? I would think it's enormous. You know, the different institutions have different ethoses. So again, I'm not convinced that, you know, that Harvard would be better for some thesis. Maybe it would be better for some theses or pieces of research than, say, Princeton or Chicago. But each of those, and I'm sorry, I've only mentioned American institutions, which I know something about. But it'd be the same in Africa. You know, if you were to do it at a certain university in Nigeria versus Cape Town, surely there would be different contexts, the way that you would have requirements for your actual research projects and how you justify it. So yeah, I'm just not convinced that any one approach is better than any other approach. But I think what should mark it is good scholarship and the principles and disciplines of good scholarship, which I think Afe has been consistently saying. And I find myself in agreement, because as an experienced researcher, you can look at a piece of work and you know whether it's good research. It looks like it. It has the right ring to it. It's like crystal that rings when you tap it. There's something about it that's convincing. And I think that we need to keep that to the forefront. You know, what is it? And that's where we get guided initially by our supervisors, but eventually we are the people making the, leading the research teams, as Afe and Retif are doing. You know, I mean, I don't know. I'm just not sure there's any, you know, I'm not sure I'm come to a particular place to answer that question.
Thank you, Bruce. And thanks, Setagwe, for that question. You must be a very good teacher. So we must get you and give you space next time to espouse your ideas. Yeah, I think this is a work in progress and a continuous conversation. And whatever field you find yourself, don't consider your field is inferior to any other.
Yes, exactly.
I think the starting point is to recognize that whatever methodology, whatever approach you are using, think seriously about the upside and the downside. Every approach, no matter how, I think Jehu raised questions about the downside of grounded theology yesterday. Just as you have a grounded theory, just name any approach that is not problematic. So the question is, how do you make use of this approach in a way that helps you while recognizing the limitations? I think that is a fair point that we need to think about. Finally, I think I was giving the example of witchcraft, teaching a course where, you know, you have to talk about witchcraft globally. Just to tell you that I went a step further each time I teach this course. I mean, when I taught this course in Germany, I take students to a witchcraft restaurant in Berlin. And German students are so shocked. When I taught the same course in Scotland, in the UK, I took students to a witchcraft shop in Edinburgh. I took my students during the Beltane Festival to visit tarot and palm readers, you know, and I said, compare this with divination in Africa. So this is how you can ground whatever you are doing, yes, you know, in a way that makes it more intelligible. When my students, whether in Europe and the US, now write essays about witchcraft, they start from their own social location. And you take an example of how Africans even see the whole, the origin of witchcraft in Scotland and the Harry Potter books. In my research among African communities who are Christians, they forbid their children to read Harry Potter books because they think it's an introduction to witchcraft. So there's a way you can contextualize all this with your research. Yeah, let's keep on with this conversation in the subsequent panel. It just remains for me to again thank Bruce for the time and for, you know, the inputs that you have brought in this conversation. And thanks to all of you who have been part of this conversation.